Okay, good morning, all of our panelists, and to this very innovative, insightful virtual meeting. As you know, the title of this virtual meeting is in recognition of the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter, a call for strengthened and shared sense of community. On June 26, 1945, world leaders convened in San Francisco to sign a treaty called the United Nations Charter. This charter, later joined with the Declaration of Human Rights, laid the foundation for universality of the dignity of humankind. Today, we are honored to present to you an esteemed group of international diplomats, practitioners, theologians, academics, to reflect on one of the most critical and transformative documents. As 2020 has unrolled, the global community experienced inter alia infectious pandemic, brutal repercussions of racial discrimination, along with ongoing socioeconomic disparities and climate change. These challenges demonstrate no greater time to reflect on the universal principles for peace, human rights, and security embodied in the UN Charter. Therefore, it is my honor to present to you this virtual meeting from Vermont, but embracing the rest of the world. Our speakers today include Dr. Gregory Sterling, the Dean of Yale Divinity School, Her Excellency Ms. Mary Elizabeth Flores, the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Permanent Representative to the UN, and opening remarks from Dr. Richard Gowan, the UN Representative for the International Crisis Group, Dr. Jennifer Hurt, the Academic Dean of Yale Divinity School, Mr. Michael Collins, Director, Institute for Economics and Peace, Dr. Massimo Tomaselli, International IDEA, Permanent Observer to the United Nations, Mr. Diego Osorio, CGIAR, Dr. Richard Mulika from the Harvard Program on Refugee Trauma, Dr. Al-Moosawi, founder and chairman of the board of Mercy Hands for Humanitarian Aid, Ms. Rita Jo Lewis, the German Marshall Fund and senior fellow and director for Congressional Affairs, and Mr. Amin Bid Khalid, permanent mission of Tunisia to the United Nations. Our meeting will conclude with summary points from Dr. Leslie Powell, the Yale Office for International Affairs. And I do have a statement that I will hold off to the end from Dr. Ram Charan, who was a former UN official who also served as the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the program over now to Dr. Gregory Sterling.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. It is a particularly poignant moment in which to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN. The preamble of the UN Charter makes 4 initial declarations. The second reads, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small." End of quote. 3 crises have converged to test our commitment to this declaration. The first is the pandemic that has now sickened more than 10 million people worldwide and taken the lives of more than 500,000, numbers that I am confident are grossly underreported. More relevantly, COVID-19 has exposed the gap in medical care along socioeconomic lines, and in some countries, along racial lines. In other words, the pandemic has shown that as a globe, we are far from valuing the dignity and worth of every human person. This gap has been exacerbated by the second crisis, the economic crisis, created by the attempts to limit the spread of the virus. Shelter-in-place orders have created significant job losses. In a recent study of 20 wealthy democracies released by the Brookings Institute, the report indicates that 38 million out of 660 million workers have filed for unemployment, including in 4 countries that have double-digit percentages of the unemployed. These are Canada at nearly 40%, Israel at 25%, Ireland just below 25%, and the US at 13%. The contraction of almost all economic measures over the last several months means that 2020 and 2021 will be difficult and challenging years. The gap between the haves and the have-nots will become even more evident and painful. The third crisis was set off when a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd on May 25th. The murder set off a worldwide reaction, a reaction that expressed both sympathy for the victims of police brutality in the United States, but also sympathy for groups throughout the world that are oppressed. Those protests have highlighted the need for all human beings to have basic human rights. While the confluence of these 3 crises may appear to be, and in some ways are, an indictment of our failure to realize the goal of the Charter of the UN, they've also created a unique opportunity. For the first time in more than 50 years, I believe that there is an opportunity to make substantial changes in civil rights in the US if we seize the moment. The fear of the pandemic, the uncertainty of the economy, and the frustration with repeated examples of flagrant police brutality against African Americans have created a willingness to change in more people than I have witnessed since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. While the dynamics are different in other countries, and I can't speak for them because I haven't been able to travel, I think that there is a corresponding openness to make substantial changes. As we consider possibilities for reaffirming faith in human rights, I hope that we will assign faith a double entendre. May we have confidence in our fellow human beings, but may we also realize that faith in the form of religion of the world can be great allies. Religions can be and have been too frequently oppressive. But we should also remember that religion is a powerful force that has often championed human rights. One need not think of only the most famous examples of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., or Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to mention some of the most famous from the 20th century, but of figures and movements who are better known to specialists and historians of specific countries like Oscar Romero and the many people who opposed oppressive regimes in Latin America. We are at a crossroads. We have a unique opportunity right now, an opportunity that does not present itself often. May we make the most of it to advance human rights throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sterling. Our next speaker is Ambassador Flores.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Grace Initiative, for the invitation to participate in the space and community in recognition of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Charter, a call for strengthened and shared sense of community. I have known Yvonne Lodico from her years at UNITAR as head of the New York office, where she did an outstanding job. And successively in the following years, where through Grace Initiative, she spearheaded projects on peace, governance, reconciliation, agriculture, and empowerment of women. Yvonne shared her vision, was inspired by her home, Vermont, which she described as inclusive and a nurturing place where its inhabitants often come together in dialogue in support of initiatives for the welfare and betterment of the community. Such a vision gave birth to the United Nations, bringing together the aspirations of all peoples of the world, created with a determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm the faith in fundamental human rights, dignity, and the worth of the human person, in equal rights of women and men and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. Today, it is the pandemic that unites us, touches on our fragility and our coexistence in the planet, and the realization that we are all one humanity. People from all walks of life are looking to make a difference. Our interconnected world will never be the same again. All has shifted in ways we cannot even imagine. The 75-year commemoration of the signing of the UN Charter, while a celebration of many past achievements and milestones, brings to light the current state of affairs, the challenges to date, and those that lie ahead. If there is one take on all of this, it could be this: we need to discover newly to create community. In exploring new realms that can provide international peace and security, and to be in the inquiry, what would the next 75 years look like? At this turning point, this is a moment of grounding and of awakening, to revisit and really discover from the language and the spirit of the Charter, where the organization can be connected and go where it has not been able to go before, and to be fit for purpose in delivering for each and every nation and people of the world that in which the inalienable rights, all of them, be exercised and expressed in their full capacity and potential. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice words that you had to say about Race Initiative. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Gowan, who is the UN representative for the International Crisis Group. Richard?
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you for the opportunity to join this very important conversation. I have worked on the UN for the best part of 2 decades, but one of the great pleasures of working in New York is that you can sometimes escape to Vermont. And so while I don't think I will be able to do so physically this summer, it's very nice to do so virtually. Yvonne asked me to reflect on the meaning of the UN Charter today and how it applies to current crises. And I found this a little ironic, in fact, because I think the UN Charter is an incredibly important document, but it's one of those documents that a lot of people cite, but not many people read very closely. I think we all know the opening lines of the Charter and its commitment to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But we often skip many of the 8,000 words or so that follow. And if you look at the Charter, you'll find some surprises. The first big surprise is that a lot of the Charter is actually about planning for future major wars. And the central conception of those who negotiated the Charter was to prepare a strong alliance to deal with future conflicts, potentially with countries like Germany. No one today refers to Article 45 of the UN Charter, for example, which calls for the creation of a UN Air Force that could carry out major warfighting missions. On the other hand, a lot of what we think is in the Charter isn't really there, or is not quite there in the way that we imagine. I think we would all agree that UN peacekeeping has been one of the great successes of international cooperation over the last 7 decades, and it's brought stability to many countries, although there have been failures along the way too. But there's no reference to UN peacekeeping in the UN Charter. It's something that later generations of UN officials created. And even though there are a number of important references to rejecting racism in the UN Charter, it's not a central part of the document. And actually, in 1945, many African leaders felt that the document was in itself a colonialist document, and they rejected it as a guiding vision. Now, I don't say this to undermine the UN Charter. I think that its fundamental message about the need for international cooperation and the universality of human rights supported by the later declaration have been crucial to framing international order and international cooperation for many years. But I raise it because I think what's remarkable about the UN is not just that we have this document from 1945, but that successive generations of UN officials and civil society actors, including faith leaders, have built so much on this foundation. And so much of what the UN does today, in dealing with everything from peacekeeping to human rights to large-scale humanitarian assistance, many of the things we're going to hear about, are efforts on a scale that the founders probably didn't imagine and didn't foresee. And what's driven that from the 1940s to today has been the creativity and the courage of individuals who've invested in the UN. Some of them are very famous names still today, such as Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, who really brought passion into the idea of an international civil service contributing to peace and security. Some are more recent figures, such as Kofi Annan, the Secretary General who died a few years ago, but I think played a crucially important role in shaping a post-Cold War United Nations that has contributed so much to human rights and peace building. I think the UN has always thrived on the creativity of those who have wanted to expand its remit and expand its vision. And here I fully agree with the ambassador and the other speakers that we need to keep on expanding the UN's vision. And there are opportunities to do that, and the pandemic, I think, is one of those moments where we can expand our thinking further. In recent years, I think we've seen the UN turning into a real centre for international activism around climate change. And current Secretary General Antonio Guterres has worked very closely with climate activists to try and fight global warming. His predecessor, Ban Ki-moon, was also a leading figure in the fight against global warming. Today, Secretary General Guterres is writing and thinking and publishing a huge amount with his team about the social, economic, and justice implications of the COVID-19 virus. And I think that Guterres has actually demonstrated a level of vision and a depth of thought about this crisis, which many national leaders have not. What we need as an international community now is for civil society leaders, faith leaders, and others to come together with Guterres and with the many, many governments that really want to see a strong multilateral response to COVID-19, to try and forge an international plan for recovery from this disease, which may take many years and which may be painful and difficult in political terms, in economic terms, and in social terms. We can't just go back to the UN Charter. It provides us an amazing basis. But as I say, what has made the UN thrive decade to decade has been how we reinterpret the Charter. And we certainly need to reinterpret it boldly now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer Hurt, the Academic Dean at Yale Divinity School. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's really an honor to be part of this important conversation. I want to begin by dwelling for a moment on the word crisis. Its earliest meaning in the English language is to speak of the turning point in an illness, that moment at which a fever peaks and finally breaks, a moment of great danger, but then also of hope. And I think it's a very apt moment to invoke that word. Looking back 75 years ago, I think we need to acknowledge what a remarkable feat it was to establish the United Nations. It's next to impossible to imagine the nations of the world coming together today to create an institution of this kind. And it took not just one, but 2 world wars and the horror of the Holocaust to bring the world together in a serious commitment to universal human dignity and global multilateralism. The institutions that were created 75 years ago to embody these commitments are threatened today from many sides, with populist and often racist forms of nationalism on the rise in many corners of the globe. In part, these institutions of global multilateralism are struggling because the United Nations has never been resourced in ways that would fully allow it to live up to the dreams enshrined in its charter. For instance, the United Nations is premised on the sovereign equality of all of its members, but those on the Security Council have in effect been more equal than others. And the United States was clearly positioned as the most dominant, the alpha male of the tribe of nations. And this was accepted because the US at that time assumed the mantle of global benefactor, using its outsized economic and political power in order to promote peace and prosperity around the globe. The intervening years have shown all too clearly how this position could be used to advance neo-colonial dominance, further enriching the wealthy nations at the expense of the poor. Domination was all too often secured in the name of advancing the cause of liberty. And as the US has lost its position of economic dominance, it has failed to maintain its mantle of moral leadership. The preamble to the UN Charter speaks movingly, as has already been invoked, of a shared commitment, quote, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, end quote. Yet the truth is that the powerful and privileged nations and the powerful and privileged races and genders and classes within each nation too often respect universal human dignity only when it suits them to do so, which typically means only when it serves their self-interest or at least does not threaten their own power and privilege. So as we look back to the moment of the founding of the United Nations 75 years ago, and as we look around today in the midst of this global health crisis, global economic crisis, and global crisis over racism, what are we to think? We might have hoped that the crisis presented by COVID-19 would stimulate global collaboration and cooperation as we find ourselves confronted by a common challenge and faced by shared vulnerabilities. And there have been some remarkable instances of cooperation, particularly at a regional level. We might think, for instance, of the creation in Europe of an inclusive vaccine alliance, with Germany, Italy, France, and the Netherlands pooling resources for vaccine development and pledging to ensure a fair price for the vaccines, enabling global distribution for the benefit of the poorest nations. But examples like this stand out against the backdrop of an utter vacuum of leadership left by the United States, which has botched its own national response to the virus and has assumed a stance toward other nations of blame and competition. If the response to COVID-19 has been a dry run for global cooperation in response to the looming and indeed already unfolding climate crisis, it does not bode well. So it would be relatively easy at this point to slide into a dismissive cynicism. And we must, I think, be sober in our assessment of human nature and of the many ways in which we favor the near and dear while dehumanizing our enemies and while remaining ignorant of and indifferent to the suffering of the poor. But while I think it would be foolhardy to be optimistic, I want to recommend a stance of active hope. It is right to take a moment to marvel at the fact that the nations of the world, many animated by deep religious faith, did come together in common affirmation of universal human dignity and equal human rights, and to seek to create institutions capable of embodying these commitments in concrete and lasting ways. We need to draw energy from that moment as we face in as clear-eyed a way as possible the challenges that face us at present. And I think there are three important lessons that we can take from the present triple-headed crisis. First, that we truly do need global cooperation and global institutions in order to meet the crises that face us. We need global cooperation in the testing, production, and distribution of vaccines in order to save untold numbers of lives and allow our massively interdependent economies to function safely. And we will need this same global cooperation in order to respond to water shortages, extreme weather events, and in order to bring about a meaningful response to climate change. We need stronger, not weaker, global institutions. Second, that while crises like pandemics and climate change threaten us all, Risk is structured. Those already disadvantaged are at much greater risk than others. When COVID-19 came, the poor were already living in close quarters, less able to social distance, already living from hand to mouth, less able to interrupt economic activities, already had weakened immunity and were therefore more vulnerable to the ravages of the virus. Lip service to universal human dignity does not secure to all conditions of life worthy of that dignity, and responsibility for securing these conditions falls on those with the resources to do so. The commitment to human rights must include a meaningful commitment to social and economic, and not merely to political rights. Third, that we cannot, as we face these truly global crises with full recognition of the uneven distribution of risk and suffering, forget the history that has brought it about that risk is so unevenly distributed, that there are wealthy nations and poor nations, privileged classes and disprivileged classes, that the wealthy nations and classes have become wealthy on the backs of the poor nations and classes, and that all of this is inextricably bound up with race and empire, and most especially with the European colonial adventure that spawned modern racism, and that to this day leaves Black, Indigenous, and other people of color struggling to breathe, a white knee pinned on their neck. We will not be able to move forward until we have come to terms with the realities of structural racism and institutional whiteness. Slavery has been aptly termed the original sin of the United States, and the fact that it has never been fully reckoned with is amply attested by the horrors of lynching, the shame of Jim Crow, and the workings of the criminal injustice system. Other nations, though, have their own shameful chapters in this history and their own ongoing forms of systemic racism with which to contend. We cannot move forward without naming and acknowledging these truths. And I take hope here from the worldwide demonstrations that have taken place in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and of the ongoing work to translate the energy of the streets into new forms of accountability and change. As with earlier civil rights movements, here too, people of faith are leading the way in speaking up to insist that no one's dignity has truly been affirmed until everyone's dignity is respected. So these are three vitally important lessons, and the crises that we face help to bring them home to us. COVID-19 has helped us feel, if for a moment, our own vulnerability and finitude. And this opens our hearts to appreciate that we share this fundamental vulnerability with others. Like them, we were weak and utterly dependent at birth. Like them, we will die and leave behind whatever wealth and power we have or have not accumulated. Crises like this open up new forms of empathy that break up our usual loyalties to our in-groups and our indifference or hostility to out-groups. This empathy is powerful, but it is also fleeting. We need to grab the moment to build and strengthen institutions of global multilateralism, institutions like the United Nations, to embody the commitment to universal human dignity that assumes passionate intensity at times like this. That is the opportunity of this moment, if we can grasp it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hurt, for those guiding words. Our next speaker is Mr. Michael Collins from the Institute for Economics and Peace.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And echoing what Jennifer said, with a world in crisis, it's very easy to forget essentially the progress that we've made, right, since the creation of the United Nations 75 years ago. And you know, while the challenges and the failures of the UN are so often discussed, it's kind of sort of refreshing to take a step back and to essentially celebrate a statement of intentions, right, which is what the charter was. At the time, the sort of the likes of the world had never seen before. As Richard noted, we're coming out of World War II. And, you know, one can really understand the Charter's focus on security, on stability, and the resolution of disputes, right? But also intrinsic to the document is the understanding that peace is much broader than security, and that it's only through the construction of positive peace, essentially, that humanity as a whole can prosper. At IEP, we often talk about positive peace. So many of you are probably sort of familiar with the term, but for those of you who are not, positive peace refers to essentially the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies, right? The sort of the cogs under the clock face, as it were. At IEP, we approach this from a sort of a quantitative perspective. We statistically analyze the countries with the lowest levels of violence in the world to see what they have in common, what it is that sort of makes them peaceful, what makes them tick. We find that the most peaceful nations on earth, broadly speaking, share 8 characteristics. We call these the 8 pillars of positive peace, right? These are a well-functioning government, an equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. And the important thing to note about these is that countries that have these characteristics, these pillars, if you will, also lead to strong economic development, right? Better environmental performance, increased well-being, and higher levels of resilience to crises, such as today's COVID-19. You know, a lot of these are things that we consider to be intuitive today. But the Charter was really sort of ahead of its time in many ways. As Richard noticed, this was 20 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed in the US, for example. And throughout the Charter, the UN makes frequent use and references to the pillars of positive peace. So with regards to well-functioning government, for example, the Charter outlines the workings of the International Court of Justice, the General Assembly, and the Secretariat. It sets member voting rights, allocates responsibilities, financial obligations, and discusses the joint removal of threats to the peace as well. Now, you know, it's debatable whether the governance structure envisioned at the time is equally applicable today, and even whether one could sort of consider it fair. But, you know, either way, the achievement, the creation of a global governance body in itself was remarkable. With regards to equitable distribution of resources, for example, the Charter talks about the sovereign equality of all its members, and it outlines ECOSOC, a tool that it says to solve international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. So today, this is essentially epitomized by the SDGs. The main framework of operation for the United Nations. With regards to the acceptance of the rights of others, numerous speakers have already noted how sort of the Charter reaffirms faith in fundamental human rights without distinction for race, sex, language, or religion. The Charter also places special emphasis on defending the rights of nations and states that previously had been undermined by colonial powers as well. With regards to good relations with neighbors, the Charter emphasizes the need to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It limits the ability of the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any member state. And it even sort of encourages the settle of local disputes through regional arrangements rather than global ones as well. With regards to the free flow of information pillar, the UN is described in the Charter as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in attainment of common ends. And it even outlines in detail the reporting flows between all of the bodies that it creates. And what was missing then with regards to civic engagement is thankfully being addressed now, right? So most recently through the UN 75 year of listening and dialogue, for example. With regards to high levels of human capital, it says the United Nations shall promote better access to education, higher standards of living, and full employment. A missing pillar, the next one, left unaddressed essentially at the time, is the sound business environment. But today the UN engages extensively with the private sector through the UN Global Compact, for example. And then finally, the last pillar would be low levels of corruption. The Charter outlines admission and expulsion from the body and outlines recourse for grievances. You know, the writing of the Charter itself is an attempt to weed out forms of corruption and promote transparent decision-making and relations. So, you know, as we can see, despite its lackings, the UN was created with great bones that sort of continue to support its development, you know, the development of that particular body today. So, you know, on days like this, I find it's just important to remember that while we continue to pressure the UN to do so much better than it's already doing, to remember what it's done already to help build positive peace around the world. So just to say, so here's to another 75 years of this very, very important institution, which in my opinion is more relevant and more needed than ever.
Thank you so much. I think probably all of us would agree with your last lines of the relevance of the UN and needed ever so more in view of all the crises that we're facing. Our next speaker is Dr. Massimo Tomaselli, and he is the International IDEA Permanent Observer to the UN. Massimo?
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and many thanks to all the panelists and the participants. Many things have been said, and I would focus on, again, on something that is not explicitly addressed, something that is missing in the Charter. Although many may think that it is indeed there, as Richard Gowan said before about other issues, and that is democracy, not explicitly spelled out in the UN Democratic Charter, despite the fact that it has become more and more relevant to the work of the UN over the years, and in particular since the 90s. Democracy and the pillars of UN work has been a major focus of the analysis of international idea on the UN as a major policy forum. Clearly, the example of elections, both in building the political conditions in the aftermath of a conflict, and also as a space for dialogue among different parties, has become prominent in the work of the UN. And it has been even at the basis of emerging new norms, for example, the norms on international election observation. But democracy is much more than just elections. And the other example I would like to make is the important normative work that the UN has been doing on the political participation and representation of women. And in general, women, gender equality and democratic institutions and processes. It would be easy to refer also to all the work on human rights. And again, one of the panelists has referred to the importance of looking at the human rights indivisibility, and therefore the relationship that is very strong between political and civil rights and other rights. An element that actually is emerging as key in the face of the current crisis, and with the possible role of the UN in supporting country efforts at responding to the pandemic crisis. But I would have also to underline that there has been a great reluctance, especially in the last few years, to explicitly address issues of democracy, democratic governance in the UN context. Even the important work that has been done on building a collective consensus on the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, for those who followed the negotiations, was based also on a great effort made by negotiators in order to capture the interlinkages between peace, justice, and the quality of institutions as envisioned in the Sustainable Development Goal 16, both as a goal in itself and as an enabler for the achievement of the rest of the goals. But this was not a given. It required a lot of effort, and even as we look now at the implementation of the agenda, we can see that some countries do not take seriously into account the importance of linking together peace, justice, and accountable institutions as a major enabler for the achievement of the framework. So there is a lot of work still to be done. I would like to focus briefly on the example of the COVID-19 crisis to highlight the relevance of democracy to the work of the UN in the current context. I will refer to the fact that the major impact of the crisis has been differentiated, and many already before me referred to the importance of taking into account inequalities and the differential impacts of the crisis on different groups and communities in societies. Inequality has grown in the face of growing democratization. So I want to stress also that this is a contentious issue, as promoting democracy is not by itself delivering on more inequality. Therefore, the quality of democracy, the quality of democratic institutions, and above all, the quality of policies is very important in order to assess whether strengthening democratic institutions and processes is actually translated into reduction or eradication of the major problems that the 2030 agenda should address, and inequality as a major dimension of that. The UN response to the crisis referred to some of the building blocks of democracy promotion. I would like to mention here, for example, the report on COVID-19 and human rights. We are all in this together, which actually was very vocal in stressing these dimensions. Still, I would like also to say that responses by governments in the immediate emergency determined by the first phase of the crisis, and even more so, state responses in the recovery perspective, with all the implications in terms of socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, is critically linked to the quality of democratic institutions and processes. I'd like to mention in this respect an open letter that International IDEA has promoted together with more than 70 democracy building institutions, which has been signed by over 500 personalities from around the world, which is entitled "The Call to Defend Democracy." The resort to emergency powers at the time of the emergency, as I'll do within constitutional frameworks, has stressed how important it is to take into account the limit that should be placed to the resort to such power, and the risk, the easy risk of abuse in making extended use of such powers by governments. And here, I do not refer only to authoritarian regimes. I would say that there is a challenge for both new democracies and established democracies in this respect. A critical importance of making more explicit UN engagements in democracy is my final message. I would like to say that, again, with respect to the post-conflict, post-COVID-19 crisis, critical elements will be to rebuild the social contract, therefore the building of spaces for dialogue, to rebuild the trust between states and citizens, and to show the delivery side of democracy. The UN, in its convening power, in its normative power, and in its work as catalyst in all countries of the world, plays a very important role in this respect. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Massimo. Our next speaker will focus on another challenge that the UN is facing in terms of building a coalition and consensus is on climate change and climate security. Our next speaker is an expert on this issue, and this is Mr. Diego Osorio from CGIAR. Diego?
Yes, well, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be with all of you. Let me just say that for me it's an honor to be talking about the Charter and to bring this particular issue here, because most of my career I have been involved with the UN as a UN officer in conflict areas, and where the fragility of states and the lack of governance really shows the reason why we created this institution. And it has been a successful one. No question about that. Certainly everything in humanity can be improved, but many of the objectives have been achieved. But then, as a diplomat, I have moved now to work for a life science institution, the CGR, the largest network on food and natural resource management and food systems. We have different centers all over the world, and basically our objective is to create science and multiply the good effects of that so that we have a more resilient, a more adaptable, and a more functional food system. And that in itself is one of the essence of what we have to do. And at the same time, one of the key factors that need to be taken into account when we're dealing with the issue of climate change. One interesting thing that we have to say about climate change is that it's a very interesting phenomena because it has two things that we find very difficult to tackle. One of them is that it's very hard to pinpoint climate change as such. Cognitively, it's everywhere, it happens all the time, and yet it's difficult to create a consensus among the people to say, well, that's the face of climate change. That's how we tackle it. That's how we have to address it. And so it's a little bit like the story of the frog in the boiling water. He doesn't realize what's happening, and yet he's going to die. And that is one thing that for us is certainly important because food is something so embedded into the normal process of daily life, and yet the systems for food are threatened by this very unique crisis. The second one is that it's a crisis that by its definition and the nature of what's involved means that it's one for which we have all the solutions. We're not in the search of a new miracle technology or a miracle thing that we might bring from another place so that we can tackle climate change. We have all the solutions. The problem has been well defined. What we have is an issue of governance, how we organize ourselves as humanity to tackle this. And that is where, as someone who worked in conflict, very much trained in all the little bits of diplomacy, and now working with climate science and with people that deal with food, with biodiversity, with soils, one lesson I have taken from this process is something that reflects the intersectionality and the nature of this very overall interdependency, is that everything depends on everything. Food systems, a specific soil, and a different type of crop, a new locus, these kind of different factors can really turn upside down a peace agreement, can change the nature of a negotiation. And this is something that we need to take into account, because if we don't, then all the most amazing security institutional design, the peace agreements, or the different types of initiatives that politicians and diplomats can come up with will not stand the test of time if they don't prove to be resilient. And that's because we need to take into account all these different factors. I just want to say that for us, this notion of intersectionality and systemic view of our own survival is essential and needs to be embedded into the Charter. It needs to be embedded into the UN system. Perhaps we might not be able to change the Charter now, maybe that's not the objective, but we certainly need to change the architecture of the system so that we have a system that allows to deal with the challenges of the future. Because we are only as strong as the weakest among us. That's one thing for sure. But we also clearly, and this is one of the crises that prove it, we are dependent on each other. If COVID-19 hasn't proven it, then maybe we should really try to extract the lesson, because the next time we have a situation like COVID-19, we might not have the capacity of the latitude to respond in a way that we have to. For me, there are three things that I need to really stress here. One is that if we agree that the idea of governance is perhaps one of the key elements, therefore we need to work on how this architecture that has been created by this wonderful charter can take on that idea of a governance. But governance in the sense of what? In the sense of having a mechanism to manage and to create the objectives by which all humans can work with for common objectives. One element that is very important for us in our institution and everybody that's working on climate change is the whole idea that we have to do much more in much less time. Certainly, there is a timeline to this. There's a finite number of opportunities. We're running out of them, and we're certainly not taking on board the best kind of options, opportunities, and knowledge to handle it. And I will just finish by saying one thing. The UN, the Charter, in 75 years has proven to be a very successful institutional design and institutional framework to maintain the peace. I will call the Charter for Peace, and that is a very useful one. But then, given the challenges we are facing now, we need to be able to move from the power architecture for peace to a human dignity architecture for a peaceful future. That changes everything, because the building block is not the containment and the proper management of power at different levels, international, local, etc., but is the promotion, the multiplication, and the enhancement of human dignity as the defining block of the entire international architecture. That is how you design a project, how you develop development, how you design a democratic system. Everything, if it's taken on the basis that the building block is the preservation and the validation of human dignity, will give us a very different perspective on how we need to move on for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diego. One thing I've been thinking, taking into consideration all of our presentations so far, is that the charter really was a document for transformation. And it did lay a foundation, but from all the presentations that we've heard this morning, everyone has recognized the importance of it, but how much the UN has progressed and advanced and how much more it has to go from there. But this charter was sort of, instead of for transformation, it was a document for transformation. And I think based on even all my years with the UN on peacekeeping and so forth, the UN has changed so much and has brought in all these linkages. And I'm sure the missions now must have to have climate security as a component for sustainable peace. So thank you so much for that presentation, and it was very thought-provoking, as all of them have been. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Mollica, and he will discuss refugee trauma, COVID.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's an honor to be here with such distinguished people who have worked with the United Nations. Our history with refugees goes back to December 1981, when we started one of the first refugee clinics in the United States. And I have to compliment, I've spent years working with UNHCR, and one of the high points was Mrs. Agata, where she finally, she decided on a policy level to integrate mental health into the work of the High Commissioner's Office. And so Mrs. Agata, through our efforts and through the World Federation for Mental Health, we put the first mental health expert ever in UNHCR in Geneva. And we're very excited about that historic moment. So I want to talk a little bit differently as a medical doctor about the charter. I was very impressed with this statement. You know, we give out to all of our medical students, residents, etc., the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which I consider one of the greatest manifestos of mankind. So, and very few doctors, we insist that they carry it around in their pocket. So we give the pocket version of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And because very few doctors know the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, in the chart, it says to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, they reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women. And I want to drill down and focus as a medical doctor on the concept of human dignity. And many of you have already mentioned this. We just heard a talk about climate change, talking about human dignity. Now, in medicine, we've been focusing on human dignity primarily through hospice, with dying patients, people who are terminally ill. And then with COVID, you know, we've had this terrible crisis where we were stacking bodies in the elevator. We weren't able to talk to families, and the whole concept of death, suffering of COVID in Italy and the United States. I work a lot in Italy as well. the whole issue of dignity came up. You know, how can someone die from COVID with dignity in this crisis? And it wasn't occurring in many places, you know. And so I want to drill down into the concept of human dignity, because I think it's fundamental to the work we're doing in our field. I have a very simple notion, going back to my days at Yale, and also, you know, I was a graduate of Yale Divinity School myself, and I had some very great teachers there, Henry Nouwen, Margaret Farley, it goes on, you know, and I came to the conclusion that there are two universal truths. All life is sacred, and the golden rule. But I have no evidence for this. This is the beautiful part. There's absolutely no scientific evidence empirically to demonstrate that all life is sacred. Now, a medical doctor talking scientifically, like, how can we prove the golden rule and all life is sacred? And at the foundation of the golden rule and all life is sacred is human dignity. And, you know, you all know the definition of human dignity, but I'm going to quote it. Human dignity is the recognition that human beings possess a special value intrinsic to their humanity, and as such are worthy of respect simply because they're human beings. What an incredible statement. But what is the evidence for this? What is the scientific evidence for this? Now, let's look at it from a negative side, where we have tremendous scientific evidence. What happens when human dignity is taken away? This is not in this declaration. What happens when human dignity and human rights are taken away? Because all refugees suffer human rights violations, for example. Now, when human dignity is taken away, it can be taken away by many ways. Racism, structural racism, poverty, environmental factors, climate change, illness. You lose dignity when you develop some, you know, Alzheimer's and things like this. Your dignity disappears. Violence, this has been the basis of our field. Natural disaster and misfortune. Human dignity can be diminished, taken away, and destroyed by many things that go on in our lives. And we know scientifically that, for instance, one of the major ways human dignity is destroyed through violence, gender-based violence, etc., and structural racism, is through humiliation. Humiliation is the main instrument of the violator, the perpetrator, taking away someone's dignity. Humiliation, the tools of humiliation are used to humiliate, to annihilate the person's culture, family, their society, and their life. And we have a lot of science about this. Now, with human dignity, we also know that there's a lot of science coming in now about what restores human dignity. I don't see this in the declaration. What restores human dignity? How, when human dignity, we're in a crisis in this world, in the destruction of human dignity, whether it's through climate change, structural racism, violence, refugee crisis, but you name all the great crises we're facing today. Dignity is being destroyed, as well as the dignity of the plants and animals. This is a whole nother story, environmental justice, which I can't go into with this talk, but I am very concerned about the trafficking and the destruction of the environment that led to COVID. The terrible destruction and rupture with nature that's led to this crisis today. And we know that in medicine, what's going on here. Now, the major instruments of recovery, and we had the dean from Yale talked about the empathy. Now, empathy is not frosting on the cake. It's not a vague term. There's hundreds of definitions for empathy, but empathy is a biological miracle that's rooted in our mirror neuron systems that were discovered in Italy about 20 years ago that every human being, plants and animals, we share a common ancestral biology. Empathy is a biological miracle. Every human being on this planet can love and be close to every other human being on this planet, and in fact can be close to animals and plants. This is not touchy-feely. This is not frosting on the cake. This is not vagueness. This is a scientific biological miracle of our ancestral relationship that Carl Jung called the collective unconsciousness. This has to be in the Declaration. We have to base human dignity on science. This is my main point. And we know that empathy restores human dignity. It's restorative. Get it? Empathy in medicine restores human dignity. And we know that even a dying patient coming to the end of their life can find joy and happiness in their life. It could be one of the best parts of their life is the end of their life. And so we have to understand this around the Declaration and moving forward, that we have to base our model on science, biological science, science of diversity, science of empathy, science of recovery, science of healing, in order to make sure that human dignity is restored in all of these. It's unbelievable to me. I've treated over 10,000 survivors of torture and mass violence. In every case, human dignity has been destroyed through humiliation. And I see this in the plant and animal world. I see, we don't have animals here in this conference right now talking, right, Yvonne? And if they were here, they would tell you when a billion birds are killed in the United States.
Go upstairs and get the cat and dog if you like.
Yeah, no, I'm serious about this. That the ecocide that's going on is so unbelievable. The human suffering of the natural world is so unbelievable that we need these people at the UN to talk. We need a human declaration of human rights for plants and animals. And so that's all I want to say is that my focus is on, let's get clear about what is human dignity, how to protect people from the destruction of human dignity, how to help people restore their human dignity, and make this based on scientific medical science. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Our next speaker is also a medical doctor, and he founded Mercy Hands for Humanitarian Aid in Iraq after the intervention took place. There were very few doctors. Richard, you weren't there, unfortunately. He was providing humanitarian aid with another doctor, and Mercy Hands has moved on to be the largest NGO in Iraq. And we are also very fortunate to be able to partner with Mercy Hands on working with vulnerable women. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass this program on now to Dr. Al-Moosawi, founder and chairman of the board of Mercy Hands.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I really enjoyed listening to all of you. You've strengthened my hope in United Nations, the institution, as well as the people. I think because Yvonne knows me well, she assigned to me the job of talking about promoting the ideals of the UN Charter in humanitarian assistance. Just a little bit background information about me. I moved to the United States in 2011. Before that, I lived all my life in Iraq. I'm originally from Iraq. When I was just 15, I remember that was my first experience with the United Nations. When I was 15, the war of 1991 happened in Iraq. The coalition forces representing the United Nations started this war on Iraq, and I became a refugee myself, or more specifically displaced with my family. And it was a humiliating experience for me. And that was my first experience with the United Nations, unfortunately. And, for years we lived in this economic blockade, just like, I guess it's very similar to the situation in North Korea. For years we lived under economic blockade imposed by the United Nations on Iraq. And that did not help, my understanding of the United Nations. In 2003, the war happened in Iraq, and right after the war, a year after the war ended, I founded Mercy Hands for humanitarian aid. And when I coined the vision of Mercy Hands, now when I look at it and compare it with the UN Charter, it's very similar to the UN Charter. Our vision is to live in a society where justice prevails, law rules, individual and group rights are preserved, differences are acknowledged and welcomed, people work together to develop and sustain resources for future generations, and man-made disasters are virtually non-existent. That is the vision of Mercy Hands. We work in conflict or disaster-affected areas to basically save lives, sustain human rights, and restore a healthy community. And we serve people in need regardless of their religion, gender, ethnicity, or political affiliation. And that is very similar to UN Charter. But still, it's not easy to convince people in a humanitarian crisis to convince them of these principles or the UN Charter or the United Nations message. But once, they start seeing what we do and our help, then they start believing in our, mission and our vision and, at large United Nations Charter. What helps us in our mission is to work with partners, international organizations, and UN agencies. That helps a lot. But I will tell you, from my experience, even people working in UN agencies and international organizations, many of them are frustrated with, the performance of the United Nations as an institution. But still people, they see the United Nations through those people working in United Nations and in international organizations. And that's very important. We work in different sectors. We, of course, whenever there is a disaster, we focus on emergency response. We provide food and non-food items, shelter, and other kinds of interventions in water and sanitation, in WASH sector. That's during emergency. Post-emergency, post-conflict, we focus on rehabilitation and recovery effort. And eventually we focus on community development, human rights, and livelihoods. And that's what we're doing now in Iraq. We're focusing on livelihoods and protection and community development. We work all over Iraq. And also we also work in Northeast Syria. We have a small mission in Northeast Syria. We have different partners. We work with UN agencies, like I said, and with international organizations. It's like I said, in the beginning, it was difficult for us to convince the people of our vision and mission, and the mission and vision of our partners, the international partners. But like I said, these things take time. The more we work with people, the more we work on, with communities, the more people believe UN Charter. But that's a work in progress, and it will take time. We understand that. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Moosawi. Our next speaker is Ms. Rita Jo Lewis. She is the Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund and the Director of Congressional Affairs. Rita?
Thank you, Yvonne, for giving me the opportunity to add some personal insights into this great discussion that we're having now. To be here with all of you to talk about the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. You know, when Yvonne said the title was going to be the call for strengthening and a shared sense of community, and more specifically about strengthening the next generation of inclusive transatlantic leaders. You know, I first looked at the words when she talked about community, and I cannot express how it is so heartfelt to see communities, not just here in the United States, come together, but communities all around the world are coming together. And they have come together around the horrific killing of George Floyd in the United States, and in combination with the horrific killings of a woman, Breonna Taylor, and then in my state, Ahmaud Arbery. It is with these horrific deaths that was not just seen here in the US, but also seen across the globe, that the conversation has intensified in foreign policy and national security circles around the voices that are out here carrying forth and representing not just our country here in the US, but countries throughout the world. And so when you start talking about diversity and inclusion, we have to be a country that is now reflected on our nation's leadership. And when we look at our leadership, we have to then talk about how are we going to expand the voices and the individuals that are going to be putting forth the policies that are going to be moving forward in the next 75. You know, much has been written, much has been reported, much has been studied about the fact that increasing diversity and inclusion of all kinds amongst our national security professionals and foreign policy leaders improves policy outcomes and ensures that we benefit from all of the best talent and experiences that all of our countries have to offer. But the question also then remains is that when diversity conversations and inclusion conversations begin to happen, people will want to look and see how is that expansion going to work. Well, I think in every one of our own individual efforts, and I think we talked about this today, you know, in our national security world, there has been a focus intensely on gender imbalance, and progress definitely has been made. But now there is efforts that must be expanded to people of color to be a part of those communities. At the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I bring my insights from being a professional who have participated in inclusive efforts and diversity efforts throughout my entire professional life. And then working at the German Marshall Fund, I've been a part of the launch of a program that had an effort that has gone on for 8 years, starting first when I was at the State Department, and then being fortunate to come over to the German Marshall Fund in its leadership program and to work with the professionals there who run our Transatlantic Inclusion Leaders Network. In running that Inclusion Leaders Network, it is really one of the most vibrant programs that I have seen, but it is not the only program that I have seen. And that's why I think we have a continued call for all allies and friends into whatever communities that you're in to move expeditiously and expand the programming that you have. Recently, about 4 years ago, we started a Women of Color in Transatlantic Leadership primarily because the voices there are missing. They're missing on not only on the US side, they're missing on the European side, but they're also missing around the globe. And with that, we have been called upon to say, how have these efforts seen success? One of the things that you will see in all the reports is that in our civil service, especially in our foreign service, around the globe, in the senior ranks, diversity needs to be recruited more, but more importantly, it also needs to be retained more. But we cannot talk about the senior ranks without also talking about the next generation in that ranks. We are in a very transformative moment in the United States, but I think we're in a transformative moment across the globe. And now it is going to call for transformative policies and for all of us to seize the opportunity to put policies in place to confront and be prepared to discuss this changing paradigm that we're in. One of the things that has been important for me as I have worked with stakeholders is to say that data matters greatly. If you don't count it, it's not real. If you don't count it, it really does not exist. Because people do not want to record those numbers, but you have to have a starting place. We have a lot to celebrate, but we also have more to do. And in that data that we are all out collecting, we see in our European partners the lack of data or to keep from collecting data. But I think movement is on the way. We see that there are currently, even in our European Parliament, there is only 29 MEPs out of a body of over 700 people. But it took new leaders, young leaders, vibrant leaders, 3 of them, in fact, who were women, who had, several of them who had worked with the German Marshall Fund's programming. And to see them challenge the establishment to say, we've got to move beyond words and we've got to move for accountability and for outcome. And so one of the things that is always important, I think, is we talk about strengthening, whether it's senior ranks or the next generation of leaders. Accountability is going to be important as we move forward. Who the individuals report to around these particular issues. And at the end of the day, it is about leadership. The leadership of how you can combine diversity and the leadership of how we can all then work together to move all of these efforts forward. These efforts are not going to be done by one community alone. These efforts to move forward in the next generation of leadership is not going to be done by the US, because as so many have said in all of the reporting, have we really lost our moral authority? We look at what's going on in our country today. And when we go abroad as US diplomats and professionals, how can we ask others to do when we in the US have not done them ourselves? But I say it is not just about our foreign policy and national security professionals in our Department of State. It is about all professionals throughout all communities, throughout all areas and sectors. We have on this call so many sectors that are talking about coming together as a community and trying to push new issues forward. But one also community that we must include is the private sector. We cannot be remiss in not bringing them into the conversation. And that's why the call for new alliances and new allies is so critically important at this time. And so I would just like to wrap up to say, all of this about the next generation of leaders to become more inclusive in our foreign policy. At the end of the day, it comes down to access to opportunity, access to information, access to resources. And that access says, do you have to move forward, push forward, new seats at the table, new vibrant voices at the table, because our younger professionals are not waiting. They're not going to wait. They have a level of impatience that is to be admired. And in that admiration, they're not going to ask politely like our generation, so many of us on this call may have. They're going to demand. And in that demanding, they're pushing for change, and they're going to continue to see change. And so I'm hopeful as we sit here on this call today talking about the 75th anniversary. And I'm hopeful that when we look at 75 years from now, those that come behind us will say that they heeded the call to understand that new, vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and in the society that we live in, all of these individuals must be at the table along with our allies and our friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, for this invitation and for this timely meeting in a context in which we celebrate as human family the anniversary of the United Nations Charter. I would like also to thank the previous speakers for their relevant interventions. My name is Amin Ben Khaled. I'm a diplomat, international lawyer and sociologist. I'm a part of the Tunisian team to the Security Council for the period 2021. I want to emphasize that here that I'm speaking in this prestigious forum as a diplomat, academician, and researcher of peace and dialogue. So my statement will be a personal statement, but inspired by the spirit of our national diplomacy. Obviously, Tunisia, my country, is a country that works for peace and security. In this regard, we received in 2015 the Nobel Peace Prize for having implemented an inclusive national dialogue, which facilitated in many aspects the Tunisian democratic transition. Our philosophy in the Security Council is to work through consensus dialogue, and I hope that my country, with the other members of this council, will achieve this goal. Ladies and gentlemen, the question of Security Council and the Charter of the United Nations is a crucial, rather complicated question, and this question deserves our full attention. I will try to go directly to the key point here. The main mission of the Security Council was established by the Charter of the United Nations. The Council is responsible of the maintenance of international peace and security. What is international peace and security? So far, the dominant approach in the Security Council is viewing peace and security from a legalist and procedural point of view. According to this approach, peace is the absence of armed conflict. Peace is no war. And this is in itself, this is a challenging mission. The other approach, which I consider to be emerging, and I'm a huge defender of this approach, is the approach which consists to consider peace from transversal and multilateral point of view. Peace is not only avoiding war, but also peace is food security, peace is digital security, peace is ecological and climate security, and last but not least, peace is health security. So we have here two approaches. A classic post-World War II approach and another postmodern approach. I call the second approach the approach of the 21st century. Now, the first and classical approach, in my opinion, finds its basis in a traditional definition of peace and security. Peace and security is pushing the danger out. This approach is basically anthropological one, based on a vision of separation of space, based on the fact of considering a safe, peace, and secure space like a space that manages to repel the danger. To where we don't know, but elsewhere, outside, elsewhere. However, today, with globalization, there is no more outside. There is no more elsewhere. Everything is inside. We cannot push the danger back into a real or chimerical space because it will come back to us even stronger and even more destructive as a danger. Today, in my humble opinion, we need NAPS. NAPS is the acronym of a new approach of peace and security, NAPS, through multilateralism by making connection and bridges between challenges and thematic in Security Council, such as youth peace and security, women peace and security, children armed conflict, hungry, refugees, climate change, to resolve them through inclusive and preventive diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me finish with this personal anecdote. A few weeks ago, my daughter, Lena, an 8-year-old child, asked me, "Dad, you told me that you are in the Security Council, right? Are you going to find a vaccine for the COVID-19? My daughter, Lena, like other children in the world, represents the emerging generation, the 2030 generation. Consider peace as whole, in harmony with 3 dimensions: nature, well-being, and ethics. And this is, in my opinion, the key spirit of the Charter of the United Nations." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and especially those frank remarks coming from a diplomat. Our next speaker is Dr. Leslie Powell. She's going to provide a summary of our virtual meeting. Leslie?
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Yes, my task is to provide a summary. I thought I'd start by pointing out a number of key words that were used in today's discussion by all of our terrific speakers, and I've put them into 2 columns. In the first column, we have dignity, community, humanity, alliance, dreams, justice, empathy, peace, sacred, mercy, voices, and human family. And in the second column, racism, crisis, domination, injustice, inequality, vulnerability, failure, fragility, violence, humiliation, and death. As I was writing these down, as all of the speakers were making their comments, I thought that this was a reflection of the 2 sides of human intention and human endeavor. And we can really see how the current global crises, and by the current crises, I mean primarily the pandemic and also the economic crisis, they throw into sharp relief how they both separate communities and separate people from one another and unite people and unite communities. They show how essential human connection is for human flourishing and how universal the human experience is, yet how divided we remain in so many different ways. If we want to focus on the positive, which I think we do, what we've seen is this cataclysmic crises in history have often sparked unprecedented collaboration and creativity. And we do see that to some extent today. We see research teams, medical research teams all across the world communicating like never before, from what I understand, on development of virus vaccine and epidemiological research. Dr. Hurt mentioned some instances of regional collaboration as well. And several of our speakers wondered whether this experience could help change our thinking and our behavior around the other big crisis, the climate change crisis. This was Mr. Osorio's focus. We can only hope that it won't take such a fast-moving cataclysm on the order of the pandemic to spur us into action on climate change. But obviously, we're seeing that it's very difficult. I just want to very briefly end with a note on the UN Charter itself and the related Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we know was adopted just 3 years afterward. Neither of these documents came out of the blue. I think it's important that we see them in the context of a long history of attempts to document and define and debate and determine rights for people in various places and in various limited contexts. Just in more or less modern times, we see language, the development of language in the United States Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, in the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. All of these earlier attempts influenced the ideas that we see now in the UN Charter and in the Declaration on Human Rights. And as Dr. Gowan said, in turn, the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have created new international norms or foundations that have then subsequently influenced so many laws and practices all over the world, including in the US, but elsewhere, the constitutions of many countries, the foundation of many, many national laws and institutions. And I think the key point I want to make is that the Charter and its ideas are always being reinterpreted. It's not before the advent of the UN, it's with the advent of the UN that there was an effective attempt to universalize these concepts and these definitions and to secure global consensus. Even if it's contested, and even if it was contested from day one through today, these concepts are always interpreted, they're wrestled with, they're understood differently in different places, they're parsed, they're applied differently. I think it's to end with the idea that crucially, the work is never done and can never, ever be finished. We always are interpreting these concepts. We're always struggling to understand them. It's only when we stop interpreting and wrestling and engaging that we encounter ultimate failure. So let's not do that. Let's look for another 75 years at least of grappling with these concepts. That's the only recipe, I think, for hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that you summarized almost what the goal of this meeting was about, was how we can look forward, how we can take this document, which really changed the world in terms of human rights, human dignity, empathy, and where are we going to go, how we can use this document as a basis for moving forward and dealing with the challenges that we have now and what we don't even know what challenges lie ahead. But I think this year, 2020, has given us a lot of evidence that we cannot always predict the challenges that we're going to have, but are we prepared? And perhaps that's what we've learned from this experience and also from the UN Charter. And I think the insights that we were provided today give us some direction from which we can move. I was going to read the statement prepared by Dr. Bertrand Ramachandran, who was the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. However, I'm just going to read the concluding statement because we've been together now for over an hour and a half. But in his concluding statement, he said that implementing human rights strategies of governance requires a global recommitment to the precept of universal declaration that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood. More than any time in its history, the world needs the inspiration and the strategies of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And with those words, I would like to conclude this virtual meeting and thank you all so much for your time and your wisdom. And we will now conclude. Goodbye from Vermont.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Cheers,
everybody.
ciao.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.